Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Art of Cybersecurity series. I am your host, Chirag Joshi, and as I mentioned, the intent of this series is pretty straightforward, is to explore the creative and the human side of cybersecurity, the side which doesn't get as much attention sometimes as the technology, the processes, and the frameworks do. And I'm thrilled for today. And I'm thrilled because I'm joined by Anu Kukar. Now, Anu and I have an interesting story on how I actually saw her in action doing the topic, which we're going to talk about today, the art of storytelling. So this was at a conference, I believe, Anu, this was last year.
Correct.
We've been connected on LinkedIn forever, and I've seen and followed Anu's work on there, which I encourage everyone to do, by the way. She's a force of nature when it comes to these things. But the presentation which she did was the topic was, and Anu can give us more insights in the topic itself during the conversation. But what I took away and what has always stayed with me is how she did it. And it was just a classic art of storytelling, leveraging the power of images, leveraging the power of engaging the audience. And the fact that despite us going to so many conferences, listening to all these webinars, a presentation sticks with you because something registered in your brain. And I think that's the storytelling element to it, which is why when I thought of this topic for the series, the art of cybersecurity, there was nobody else I could think of besides Anu to actually have the conversation with. So I'm delighted to have Anu here. And we can post all about Anu's accomplishments and her bio in the comment section here. But I would like to hand it over to you, Anu, just to give us a quick flavor of just a little bit about yourself and starting off with that story and continuing on with that, and then we can get in the meat of the topic.
Sounds great. No, thank you for the warm introduction and great to be here. I have to say, I'll even do my introduction using storytelling. How about that?
There we go, right into it.
So look, I will say my story is A to C, which is a chartered accountant to cyber. Yeah. So I'll call it accountant to cyber. Basically, I started my career as a tax accountant and I moved into internal audit, then governance, risk and compliance. I've then gone into supply chain, transformation, risk innovation, then into the cyber data, emerging tech risk space. So not your typical cyber journey, but there you go. That's my introduction in. I normally even do my introduction using my name. So I might even share that. So I'll say A is for I'm an advisor. So I'm an advisor at IBM to clients around cybersecurity. The N in my name stands for nurturing talent. So I love coaching and mentoring. And the U stands for untangling. So I'm very good at and known for untangling cybersecurity and enterprise risks through transformations that clients are doing. So there you go. That's my 20-year career, 10 years in consulting, 10 years in industry, and I've done it through storytelling.
How good is that? I mean, that's something which is just a takeaway off the bat for the audience, right? The whole point of the series, as we've discussed, Anu, is just giving people some actionable things that they can take away. There is plenty of material out there, information out there, but what I've seen lacking is just actionable outcomes. And what you just described, just by the virtue of your name, right? And just using that as a way of introducing yourself. I think that in itself is remarkable. So thank you. And the journey which you described is obviously very familiar to me and personal to me. My wife has been through a similar journey in terms of her career from the accounting background now into cybersecurity. So I have a lot of respect for people who make that transition. It's not an easy transition, and it goes through. It probably requires a topic all in itself.
It does.
And maybe that's where Anu, if you're comfortable, you can talk about the initiative that you have on that. That wasn't planned, by the way, guys, and that's how we like to do this. These are authentic conversations.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I will say it is a tough journey. And I would say that for anyone listening and who is in cybersecurity, we all know that we have got a talent gap. There is 1.8 million cyber roles in today, 2022, unfilled. And there is about 26 new types of cyber roles coming through: cyber compliance, cyber legal, cyber risk. We need people with diverse backgrounds. And so I'm an example with accounting background. Chirag, your wife is an example. Yeah. I've got two amazing associates in my team. One's got a law degree. The other person's got a psychology and geopolitical degree. Yeah. So critical and so relevant in cyber. And so what we've done is we've started a global course, which is called Switch to Cyber. So it's online on all the social media channels. Basically, anyone who wants to switch into cyber, you can join the campaign and you will be buddied up with a cyber professional. So you'll have a cyber buddy who will actually help guide you through all the free material and steps of how I did my journey. I had my lovely brother, Anu Kukar, who helped me through. He was my cyber buddy. We're doing that, and we've got 21 global organizations supporting this campaign, and we just started less than a month ago. So certainly something for your listeners to take away, to either join as a cyber professional, or if you know someone who's trying to switch, we've got a whole global course that's helping people do it.
Yeah, and look, it's such a critical thing for us to do as an industry, but it also reinforces that there is no one type of a cybersecurity person, or not one skill set, and the complementary disciplines that are joining forces with the traditional cyber, so to speak, are really important. And looking forward to the initiative. And again, it's a big shout out to the work you're doing there. And like I said, it is not easy. It needs the right guidance, and having an initiative like that backing them is a great outcome. Okay, so on the topic of storytelling, it's for me, the reason why I want to explore this is ultimately when it comes to stories, right? And we'll talk about why stories are important. I'm keen to get your sense of why stories are important. But for me, it's as much a part of our evolution as anything else. It's like human beings from beginning of time have been relying on stories to communicate information, to share wisdom, to pass down the teachings. It's just who we are. It makes us human. And multiple studies show this, be it neuroscience, be it other areas, where if our emotions are impaired, our decision making is impaired. And nothing stirs emotions like stories. So when it comes to business decision making, cybersecurity influencing, stories are a key part of it. But I'm keen to get your thoughts, Anu, on what you view the role of storytelling and why is it important?
Yeah, look, I think you're spot on. I don't have all the stats, but I've been reading them all, and you're absolutely spot on. All the stats are saying why storytelling is important. It is around, it sticks, people will remember it. It's an emotional connection. So I think that's absolutely, I think I didn't know the stats when I started doing storytelling. I think for me, there were probably two key things. English is not my first language. And so rather than coming up with presentations and memorizing it or reading lots of English when it's not your first language, you can become a bit self-conscious.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of fear and insecurity. So I turned to storytelling because that means that there is an image and there is a story, and I can then talk to that story, which is, again, simple English.
Yeah.
And it's a story that I can, I guess, articulate in my own words and way, not fearing that, oh, have I said the wrong sentence, or have I not explained the technical concept correctly? So a lot of that fear and I guess that personal sort of consciousness, really overcoming that for me was through storytelling. And I also have found where I've led technical teams through my career and other people where English is not their first language, I've encouraged my team members to use storytelling because, one, it builds their confidence in public speaking and presenting, but it also allows technical concepts, whether it's cybersecurity. I worked in tax. Think about when one of my favorite stories is when we were doing internal audits. Think about any organization who's going to enjoy getting a 50-page audit report, got to read it through. What if you had a nice story when you went to the board and explained, well, we did this audit, this is what we found, this is what you need to do. And we use it through a story. It's much more engaging, it's more fun. Yeah. The example I use is pen testing. Like, we do a pen test audit, it is so technical. So I say to my team where I've had technical people, try and find a story. It's going to be easier to get a technical concept across, especially to senior stakeholders where we want to take the technical jargon out.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much how or why I really got into storytelling.
No, it's great, right? I mean, and it's an actionable outcome where, as opposed to one, I think just reading stuff without, we've all been through presentations where people are literally reading off the slides, and I don't think that's any way a good way to engage audiences. So that's the topic. But even with boards and execs and different audiences within organizations, and it's actually a segue. Another topic I wanted to ask you is, you already talked about how to make it real and different contexts to use it. Now, the question I have is, a big challenge a lot of people face is the translation, right, from business to technology. And for cybersecurity, which we've always said exists for enabling the business, otherwise, what's the point of it all in itself? Uh, Business stakeholders, in my experience, are now more engaged than they ever were. Boards are more engaged, execs are everybody wants to know more about this, right? So how do I get attention to cyber is not as much of a topic as it was 5 years back. Now the question is, well, you have the attention. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to get the outcome and the elements to it? And the question to you is, are there a couple of examples that you can think of top of your head where you kind of essentially leverage that storytelling to an outcome, and that led to something that you wanted to in terms of a positive message?
Yeah, look, absolutely. What I'll do is I'll start with maybe sharing with storytelling. There are probably 3 key techniques so that every listener here can take those techniques away. Storytelling I found, so this is not something I've read anywhere, just reflecting on how I've used storytelling. Number 1 technique I've used is an analogy. So one of the examples at the conference, which is the New South Wales Cyber Resiliency Summit, where Chirag, you and I met.
Yes.
I had a photo up, which was from Dubai. It was 2 dolls sitting on the opposite ends of some steps. It was a beautiful photo I'd taken when I was there on holidays, and it was actually a painting. It looks real, absolutely amazing. And all I used was that those 2 dolls sitting on the opposite end of those staircases, I used that to explain something around cyber security regulation, that it's not a compliance issue, it's not a security issue. So I used an analogy by using that photo, which had 2 people sitting at the opposite end, trying to show that we can't have compliance and security on opposite ends. They need to work together. So my technique number 1 is have a little analogy. You just need a photo and an analogy to go with it. That's one of the simplest ways. The second tip, which gets a little bit harder, but again, something that you can use from every day, is a technique called representation. So again, in that conference that we met, and I think I was presenting just before lunch, I had a lovely photo up of 3 types of foods, and I was talking about entrees, the golgappas from India, the Mediterranean main, and the French dessert, if I remember correctly. And as much as we were all thinking about food, there was a cyber analogy around it. And I was making the point that we don't go out for dinner or lunch and go to 3 different restaurants for the 3 different cuisines. We normally go, okay, we're having Thai tonight or Indian. But I used that representation of 3 photos with those 3 different cuisines to make the point that from a cyber perspective, companies are using multiple cloud providers and talking about what the risks are. And the fact that 12 months later, you are smiling and remembering shows that story stuck.
Exactly. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
So representation is another really good way where if you're talking about multiple cloud providers, rather than saying that or writing it down, I just used an image of 3 different types of food to get that message across. That again, and you need to do a bit of prep for it, but it's still doable. The hardest one is the purest of storytelling, and I call it storytelling. Another photo I used in that conference was I had a Lego train, which sort of represented the Harry Potter train, but it was actually a train in the photo. But my whole story was around the Mumbai trains and the deaths that were happening in front of the trains on the rail crossing. And my whole story, which was a real story, I think I spoke about the story for 5 minutes. And then my point was, well, hang on, the cyber controls we put in place, we can't just put a bell and put the crossings. We needed to educate people. We needed to actually get into the human behavior. Now that is probably the hardest, where you find a real story there is meaning to it, and you find an image that represents that story.
Yeah.
So they're the three techniques that I would say you could do. I would start with an analogy or representation, and I use all my holiday photos. The best part of it, there's no copyright issues. Like, you don't have to worry about it.
That's smart. No, absolutely. So it's analogies, representation, and storytelling, right? Like the behavior aspect of it, which is what you would recommend in terms of making your content more relatable, more engaging. And I'm quite passionate about this, as you know, and it's really about the fact that for me, when I did my book, it's the analogies thing is really important, and I actually had. And talking of analogies, if my listeners can hear the barking in the background, that's my puppy. And actually, I didn't use his picture, but there was a picture of a puppy coming out of a shower with a toothbrush. And an analogy I'd used at that time was, as easy as it is to use the same toothbrush to brush your teeth and your puppies, it still is not a good thing. So don't use your same password for multiple accounts, right? And all I had a picture to start with, and I didn't even say any words. And I think it's really important to have that element of humor and relatability there. In terms of board reporting and exec reporting, what are the principles? How would you relate these principles to that, which is slightly different, right? It's a tighter agenda item, a different audience. You have less flexibility, shall I say, to be more innovative in some areas. How do you translate storytelling? Because you can still do that.
Yeah, you can, and I think that's where, whether you use it in a boardroom, or whether you use it for senior stakeholders, or if you use it for engaging business stakeholders. Like, if you're in an organization, in an industry role, I was facing into certain stakeholders, or if you're now, like I'm at IBM, I'm in a consultant, so client presentation. So to me, there are sort of 4 or 5 different categories of stakeholders, the board one being the hardest. I have gone in when I was in industry, and we used to present our quarterly reports. I used to focus a lot on data-driven reporting. Right. So there was a lot of graphs and data, but I would have a story to sort of, you don't go in and talk to your 10-page report. You've got to really go, what does the board need to know? Yeah. What's of concern? What are you doing about it? Where do they need to focus and be aware of? I would generally come up with some analogy or some story that pretty much made the point. So I would share the story and then tell my 3 points. Yeah. I would say I didn't do that from day one. I think about 2 years in, once I developed some confidence and really built a rapport, I evolved my storytelling with the board. But I did, when I was in consulting beforehand, in a previous role before IBM, I actually was invited to a board to do a 2-hour, like an education awareness session. Now, that session for 2 hours, could you imagine if I had lots of PowerPoints with writing? It would have been suicide, honestly. Yeah. I would have bored the whole board and the executive team. What I did instead was I had a slide and I said, I'm going to be talking about 10 cybersecurity and risk elements. And then I went one by one through the 10. And for each one, I just had one image, one analogy, one story, one representation, talked about it, took them around, traveling around the world, sitting in that boardroom, and asked them questions, got them engaged. And we basically went well over the 2 hours, but the chairperson was like, this is so engaging. One person said, are we going to get a copy of the presentation? I said, no, you're not, because there's no point. There is 10 photos from my personal holiday collection. There's no writing. If you want to take something away, you need to take some notes, but I want you to remember 10 stories. Yeah. So that is probably my most successful board presentation, and the feedback was amazing. They still remember me till today.
No, that's awesome. I think that's the power of images is just amazing to convey it. And the thing is, though, and people need to recognize that this is hard. What you're saying is the harder way to do it, as opposed to just having picture like text on your slide that you can read through, because that's easy, right? You have all the content in front of you. The problem is it does very little to influence people. It's not very memorable. And the last thing that which you really need is, in this day and time, is you need people's attention, right? You need people's attention. So if you're going to lose them in the first what have different studies say different things. But within first 30 seconds, apparently people make a cautious choice of they want to engage with you or not. Yeah. And if you start with somebody who's just reading off a slide, I think you're going to lose that quickly. So, but the point you brought up is a good point, is the audience and the context, because that matters. And in context of cybersecurity, as you said, you started the principles and your pictures to explain the journey. What I find also useful is making it very real to them very quickly on the business connection. And you can do that, even with pictures, or you can do that with what you're communicating with them as well. But I think you need to have, even if you're presenting your risks, your controls, your investments required, the incidents or whatever you are presenting, if you have a start and a finish, like what's the story? Ask yourself, and that's my view, is like what's the story you're trying to tell? Ask yourself,
yeah,
if you were them, what do you want out of this? And work backwards, right? Too often we are all too happy to present facts,
yes,
as opposed to like the ask. And the ask needs to be for the person to understand the language that they understand in. So I'm have you ever seen, and this is just me keen to understand, like from your perspective, of all the conferences that you've spoken at, attended, you don't have to name names here, but a presentation or a pitch where the person just lost you. The content was all good, but they just lost you in how they presented that information.
Yeah, look, I think we've all been in those situations, and to be honest, let's not pick someone else, probably myself, before I did storytelling. I can imagine early on in my career when I had PowerPoints, lovely heading, all the correct font and full stops, and the bullet points are all correct. Like there's no, when you have the square and the circle, all the perfect font. I would say the classic mistakes, and what really, I would have lost my audience, no doubt. Yeah. It would have looked pretty, but it would have been damn boring, number one. Like you can have the best color coordination and the best image, which does nothing. Like just the standard sort of image doesn't do anything. So I think that I would have been an absolute failure, just having all that writing. Second thing I think really can have people sort of get sort of lost in any messaging is, what's your voice? What's your projection?
Yes.
So what's your level of energy? How are you kind of modulating it up and down? When are you speaking too fast? When are you slowing down? When are you pausing? I remember early on in my career, part of my consulting life, Deloitte actually sent us on presentation workshops.
Right.
And it was about practicing how and when to pause, when to speak fast, when to slow down, and for different audiences. So, but before that training, I'm sure, and again, we all have our good days and bad days, but I think it's not just the writing, it's also the voice modulation. Even if I had a really good story and no writing, but if my tone is like blah, 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 like monotone, even the best story wouldn't go. So I'm actually of the belief storytelling is definitely much better than the words.
Yeah.
But nothing kills the communication more than your projection and voice modulation.
That is absolutely, and that's something which I feel, in my view, a lot of smart professionals, right? People who are technically very, very smart and sharp, sometimes don't come across very confident, because they are conflicted in, oh, I know this, but I also know what I don't know. And that is a good self-awareness to have. But when you're communicating with an audience, if you come across unsure of yourself, to your point, the way you speak, and if you're not coming across as engaging, because you are there as an authority, that's why you're there. And you need to give confidence to people, put the caveats where you need to, but inspire confidence. So I'm keen to ask one question. I'm always motivated to keep these sessions short and sharp for audience. But the one question I have, based on the training that you went through in terms of pausing and your modulation, if you are dealing with an executive audience, what do the pauses look like versus if you're dealing with a mass audience?
Oh, that's a good question. And I can't remember what I learned at training. I'll go from personal experience. So if I was in a boardroom here versus say I was in the US a couple of years ago presenting at the Institute of Internal Audits, I think we had 300 people in the audience. I think I paused more in front of 300 people, just giving me enough time to, on the stage, look at everybody. Like, because you've got 300 people. So I would say, if I think back, I would have paused more to make sure I had time to cover the whole audience and engage. Whereas with a board, it's about really getting in, setting that scene short and sharp, and pause to see if there's any questions before you're going. So I think I would have had less pauses there, but my messaging would have been a lot more succinct, whereas a bit more extended to allow me to cover the stage in front of an audience. So I think that room size and how you're positioning yourself accordingly also is something you need to factor in when you're presenting.
Absolutely. Look, that is such a good one. It's because, I mean, people think pauses are bad, and I actually think it's good to pause because, one, it allows you to think, and two, it keeps the audience waiting. Again, there's a limits to these things, right? You can't pause for 5 minutes, then it's awkward. But I think people feel the need to just rush in and fill the silence. Sometimes silence is your friend, not necessarily your enemy when it comes to that. Look, I think you've covered a fair bit, and the one thing I'll also mention in terms of the takeaway, which you mentioned, I think is worth highlighting, is the energy bit. And it's energy is big, and I think, and I must have probably Tony Robbins who had this idea of, the way he explains, if I recollect it correctly, is your state, your story, and your strategy, right? Yeah. No, look, any parting words for the audience?
Look, I'd say from all the tips that you and I have both as a combo shared, I'd say if you do nothing else, like focus on your own energy level for your voice. And secondly, whatever message you have, try and find an image. Start with a simple image instead of 5 bullet points. And my example is in risk management or in cybersecurity, we say it's everyone's business. Rather than saying it and putting the 3 lines of defense or putting the regulation written up there, find an image. Think of a story. I've got a few, but I'm going to say here's some homework for every listener. Think about how are we going to communicate that cybersecurity is everyone's business. Sounds good. Thanks so much, Chirag, for having me.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.